They walked in thinking it was an easy robbery, just some repair shop, a mechanic working alone, the perfect target. But what they didn't know was that this man was once one of the most feared killers in the city. When he picked up that wrench, the gangsters realized they had made a fatal mistake. What happened next? This was just the beginning. Subscribe for more incredible stories. The rain fell relentlessly on Portland that October night. The streets of the old Hawthorne district had turned into improvised rivers where the water carried away the worries of a city that never fully slept. On the corner of a forgotten street, a small auto repair shop remained open despite the hour and the weather. A weathered sign that barely read Wilson's Auto Repair swayed in the wind. Inside, Robert Wilson, a 52-year-old man with a face marked by time and hands toughened by work, meticulously cleaned an engine part. His movements were precise, almost hypnotic. The old radio in the corner played classic blues that could barely be heard under the patter of rain on the metal roof. Robert's tranquility was interrupted when the door burst open. 3 men soaked by the rain entered the shop. The first, who clearly led the group, wore a worn leather jacket and had a look that told stories no one would want to hear. The other 2, younger and nervous, flanked their leader while scanning the place with restless eyes. "The money from the register. Now," ordered the leader, making a threatening gesture toward Robert. The other 2 began to search the shop, moving tools and rifling through drawers with rough movements that contrasted with the meticulous organization of the place. Robert observed them with disconcerting calm. He slowly wiped his hands on an old rag, stood up from his workbench, and responded in a quiet voice. "There's not much money here. Repair shops don't make as much profit as you might think." The leader frowned, visibly irritated by the mechanic's calmness. "We're not asking, old man. Do what we say." He struck the tool table to emphasize his point. At that moment, one of the men found something peculiar at the back of the counter, an antique gold watch. The piece shone with a luster that spoke of other times and other lives. Curiously, he brought it to his boss. "Look what I found, boss," he said, extending the watch. The leader took the object in his hands and examined it. His eyes opened in astonishment upon reading the inscription on the back. A sudden recognition transformed his face. This can't be," he muttered with a faltering voice. "What's wrong, boss?" asked the man, confused by the reaction. "This watch belonged to a man who disappeared years ago. A man that nobody ever found. A man who—" Before he could finish his sentence, Robert had already moved. With a speed and precision that didn't correspond to a simple mechanic, he grabbed a wrench and struck the nearest man, disarming him with surprising skill. The second tried to react, but Robert neutralized him with a precise blow to the throat that left him breathless on the floor. The leader, who until that moment seemed to be in control, was now trembling. His eyes reflected a primal fear, the recognition of a terrible truth. "It's you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Robert cleaned the stained tool and walked slowly toward the last man still standing. "It was him," he corrected, in an almost melancholic tone. "But you didn't leave me any choice." The leader tried to use his weapon, but fear made his hand shake too much. Before he could pull the trigger, he felt an impact on his wrist that sent his gun flying. He fell to his knees, looking at the man who, according to all stories, should have been gone for years. Outside, the rain continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the night. When it was all over, Robert returned to his counter, took the watch, and contemplated it for a long time. The piece he had sought for so long had vanished, and he knew that from that moment on, his past would find him again. The next morning, Portland awoke under a sky washed clean by the storm. Emily Parker, a 35-year-old investigative journalist, walked determinedly through the streets of Hawthorne. With her black hair pulled back in a casual ponytail and a notepad in hand, she approached the auto repair shop that had been the subject of rumors in recent months. Emily had been following strange stories about a solitary mechanic who seemed to have an enigmatic past for weeks. What began as a simple article about local businesses had become an obsession for her. There was something about that man that didn't fit, something her journalistic instinct couldn't ignore. Upon arriving in front of the shop, she paused a moment to observe the place. It was a modest establishment, clean but unpretentious. She took a deep breath and entered, causing the small bell on the door to ring. Robert was bent over the engine of an old Volkswagen. Hearing the bell, he looked up, and his eyes met Emily's. For an instant, something indefinable passed between them, as if both recognized in the other someone who kept secrets. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," Emily greeted with a professional smile. "I'm Emily Parker from the Portland Truth. I'm doing a story on traditional businesses in the neighborhood, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." Robert looked at her fixedly, as if evaluating her intentions. Finally, he nodded slightly. "There's not much to tell about a simple auto repair shop, Miss Parker," he responded, turning his attention back to the engine. "But go ahead, ask what you want." What neither of them knew at that moment was that this simple interview would be the beginning of a story that would unravel long-kept secrets, revealing a past that Robert had tried to bury and that Emily was destined to discover. Emily carefully observed every detail of the shop, while Robert answered her questions with short, measured phrases. The place was impeccably ordered, each tool in its exact place, as if that precision were more a necessity than a virtue. There was something about the way that man moved through the space, with an almost military economy of movement, that aroused her curiosity. "How long have you been in this neighborhood, Mr. Wilson?" asked Emily, pretending to take notes while actually observing the mechanic's hands that seemed to tell a different story than that of a simple worker. "5 years, he replied without looking up from the engine. "I came from Michigan looking for tranquility." "It's curious that you chose Hawthorne to find tranquility," she commented with a slight smile. "It's not exactly the quietest neighborhood in Portland." For the first time, Robert looked at her directly. His dark eyes seemed to study her with an intensity that made Emily feel a chill. "Sometimes, Miss Parker, true silence has nothing to do with external noise." That answer hung between them like an enigma. Emily was about to ask something else when the shop door opened and a man of about 60 entered, wearing an impeccable suit that contrasted with the atmosphere of the place. "Robert," exclaimed the newcomer with a familiarity that seemed forced, "I came to see if my car is ready." Robert tensed almost imperceptibly, but Emily, trained to catch these small details, noticed it immediately. "Mr. Edward Vaughn," said Robert in a neutral tone, "your vehicle will be ready tomorrow, as we agreed." The man, whom Emily now identified as Edward Vaughn, one of Portland's most influential businessmen, turned his attention to her with evident curiosity. "I didn't know you had visitors, Robert. Aren't you going to introduce us?" Robert made the introductions reluctantly. Vaughn took Emily's hand and held it longer than necessary. "Emily Parker, I've read your articles. You have an incisive style. What brings you to this humble shop?" "A story about traditional businesses," she responded, gently withdrawing her hand. "Mr. Wilson has been very kind to receive me." Vaughn let out a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Robert? Kind? Now that's a novelty." He looked at the mechanic with an indecipherable expression. "Our friend here isn't exactly known for his warmth." The key tension in the air was palpable. Robert limited himself to cleaning his hands on a rag, a gesture that Emily had already identified as a habit when he wanted to buy time. "If you'll excuse me," Robert finally said, "I have work to do." "Mr. Vaughn, I'll call you when your car is ready." "Miss Parker, if you already have enough for your article." It was a clear dismissal. Emily nodded, but she had no intention of leaving things like that. Her instinct told her she had found something important, although she didn't yet know exactly what. "Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Wilson," she said, extending a card to him. "If you think of anything else you'd like to share for the article, you can call me." Robert took the card with a slight nod. Vaughn, for his part, offered to accompany her to the door, an apparently courteous gesture that Emily interpreted as an attempt to speak with her alone. Once outside the shop, Vaughn changed his affable expression for a more serious one. "Miss Parker, I wonder what you're really looking for in Robert's shop." Emily maintained her professionally neutral face. "As I told you, I'm doing a story about—" "Please," Vaughn interrupted her with a disdainful gesture. "We both know that a journalist of your caliber doesn't waste time on stories about auto repair shops. unless there's something more that interests you. Emily decided to play the same game. And I wonder what a businessman of your level is doing personally, bringing his car to a shop in this neighborhood when you could send it with your driver to any luxury dealership. Their gazes met in a silent duel. Finally, Vaughn smiled, but it was a smile that conveyed no warmth whatsoever. I'll give you some advice, Miss Parker. There are stories that are better left unburied, for your own good. Without waiting for a response, he walked away toward a luxury Mercedes parked a few meters away. Emily watched him leave, more intrigued than intimidated. The veiled threats only confirmed that there was something valuable to discover. She looked back at the shop, where Robert had resumed his work as if nothing had happened. But something in the mechanic's posture told her that he was alert, aware of her presence still. That night, in her small apartment filled with books and newspaper clippings, Emily began to investigate Robert Wilson. To her surprise, there was barely any information about him before his arrival in Portland 5 years ago. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, without a past or history. Her search led her to also inquire about Edward Vaughn. The businessman had an apparently impeccable record, president of several charitable organizations, respected widower, a key figure in the region's economic development. But Emily knew, from experience, that perfect facades often hid the deepest cracks. Meanwhile, at another point in the city, Robert contemplated the antique gold watch in the dim light of his modest home. He held it like someone holding a fragment of his soul, with reverence and pain in equal parts. What had happened the previous night in the shop had broken years of careful routine. Now the visit from that journalist and Vaughn's unexpected appearance confirmed his fears. His past had begun to catch up with him. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had sworn never to use again. "It's me," he said simply, when they answered on the other end. "They've found me." The voice that responded sounded worried. "Are you sure, brother?" "Completely. I need your help, Michael, like in the old days." "You know we left those old days behind for a reason," Michael responded cautiously. "What happened exactly?" Robert looked again at the watch in his hand. "Last night 3 men came to the shop. One of them recognized Dad's watch." A heavy silence settled on the line. "That's impossible," Michael finally said. "Nobody knows you're alive, much less that you're in Portland." "Someone knows. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Vaughn appeared in my shop today." Michael sighed deeply. "I'll be there tomorrow. Don't do anything until I arrive, and Robert, don't trust anyone." The call ended, leaving Robert immersed in memories he had tried to bury for years. Memories of a life that was no longer his, of a man he no longer was. The next morning dawned clear, as if the storm from 2 nights ago had cleaned not only the sky, but also the shadows that stalked Portland. Emily arrived early at the newspaper office, with dark circles that revealed a night of intense investigation. On her desk, she spread out the little she had managed to find out about Robert Wilson. A residence certificate from 5 years ago, a commercial registration of the auto repair shop, and nothing more. It was as if before settling in Hawthorne, the man simply hadn't existed. "You look terrible," commented Jessica, her colleague at the newspaper, as she offered her a steaming coffee. "Another night chasing ghosts?" Emily smiled, thanking her for the coffee. "They're not ghosts if I can prove they exist," she responded, showing her a photograph she had discreetly taken of Robert's shop. "There's something about this man that doesn't add up, and when something doesn't add up, you don't rest until you find the missing piece," completed Jessica, rolling her eyes. "I know. Just be careful, okay? Especially if Edward Vaughn is involved. That man has powerful friends." Emily was about to respond when her phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Miss Parker." Robert Wilson's deep voice sounded different on the phone, almost unrecognizable. "If you're still interested in your article, I have something that might interest you, but not at the shop. Could we meet at Laurelhurst Park in an hour?" Emily looked at the clock, surprised by the unexpected turn. "Of course, Mr. Wilson. I'll be there." When she hung up, Jessica was looking at her with concern. "Please tell me you're not going to meet alone with a mysterious man you hardly know anything about." "I'm not going to meet alone with a mysterious man I hardly know anything about," repeated Emily with a mischievous smile as she gathered her bag. I'm going to discover what that mysterious man I hardly know anything about is hiding. Emily, Jessica called out when she was already heading to the door. If you don't come back in 2 hours, I'm calling the police. Always so dramatic, Emily responded, but they both knew that deep down she appreciated her friend's concern. Laurelhurst Park was one of Portland's green lungs, an oasis of calm amid the urban hustle. Emily arrived before the agreed time and chose a bench with good visibility from where she could see visitors entering the park. She observed families enjoying the day, elderly, couples walking slowly along the paths, children running amid laughter. Everything seemed so normal, so peaceful, and yet she was there waiting to unravel a mystery that she felt was getting closer and closer. Exactly at the agreed time, Robert appeared at the main entrance. He was dressed differently, with a clean shirt and formal pants instead of his usual work overalls. In his hand, he carried a small package. Emily observed him approach, noticing how his gaze systematically swept the surroundings, a behavior that didn't seem typical of a simple mechanic. "Thank you for coming," he said, as he sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your call intrigued me," Emily responded. "You don't seem like the type of person who changes his mind so easily about talking to journalists." Robert smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Emily had seen from him. "And you don't seem like the type of journalist who settles for writing about local businesses." For a moment they sized each other up, recognizing in the other someone who kept more than they showed. "Why did you call me, Mr. Wilson?" Robert looked around once more before answering. "Because I need someone to know the truth, and you seem to be someone who values truth above all else." He opened the small package he was carrying, revealing the gold watch that Emily had glimpsed briefly in the shop. "This watch belonged to my father," he explained, running his thumb over the worn surface. "It was the only thing I had left of him when we separated." Emily observed the watch carefully. It was a beautiful piece, antique, with an inscription on the back that she couldn't quite read. "There are people who would give anything to have this watch," Robert continued. "Not for its material value, but for what it represents, for what it could reveal." "And what could it reveal?" asked Emily, increasingly intrigued. Robert was about to answer when his attention shifted toward the park entrance. Emily followed. His gaze and saw a man who looked remarkably like Robert, though younger and with graying hair. The newcomer quickly located them and headed toward them with a determined step. "My brother," explained Robert, visibly tensing. Michael Wilson approached the bench with a serious expression. He dressed with the casual elegance of a university professor, which contrasted with his brother's simpler appearance. "Robert," he greeted with a tone that mixed affection and reproach. "I told you to wait." Then he turned to Emily, evaluating her with eyes that, like his brother's, seemed to see beyond appearances. "You must be the journalist, Michael Wilson," he introduced himself, extending a hand that Emily shook firmly. "Emily." "Parker, it seems my reputation precedes me." Michael smiled humorlessly. "In our situation, Miss Parker, it's prudent to find out about those who take an interest in us." "Michael is a history professor at the University of Ann Arbor," explained Robert, "and an expert at keeping secrets." The tension between the brothers was evident, as if they were having two simultaneous conversations, one out loud for Emily and another silent one just for them. "My brother seems to have decided that you are trustworthy," said Michael, sitting on the other side of Emily. "I hope for everyone's sake that he's right." "You still haven't told me what it is you want to entrust to me," responded Emily, looking alternately at the two brothers. Robert looked again at the watch in his hand. "I want to tell you who I really am, and why Edward Vaughan pretends to be my friend when in reality, 15 years ago, he ordered the elimination of me and my entire family." Emily felt the air escaping from her lungs. This wasn't the story she had expected to discover when she began investigating the mysterious mechanic. "Robert, for God's sake," interjected Michael with a tense voice. "We can't simply—" "There's no more time for caution, Michael," Robert interrupted him. "They already know I'm alive. It's only a matter of time before they come to finish what they started." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain an inner storm. "At least not here," he finally said. "Not in public." Robert nodded and stood up. "I have a safe place where we can talk," he told Emily. "If you still want to hear the story." Emily knew she should feel afraid, that she should call Jessica and tell her where she was, what she was doing. But the instinct that had made her one of Oregon's best investigative journalists told her she was in front of the story of her life. "Let's go," she said simply, standing to follow the Wilson brothers. What none of the three noticed was the figure observing them from a distance, hidden behind dark glasses and the newspaper he pretended to read. When the trio left the park, the figure dialed a number on his phone. "I have them," he said in a low voice. "They're with the journalist. It seems that Robert Mitchell has finally decided to tell his story." On the other end of the line, Edward Vaughan received the news with a grim gesture. "Follow them," he ordered, "and let me know when they settle. I'll take care of the rest." Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in downtown Portland, an elderly woman contemplated an old photograph. In it, a young Robert smiled next to a beautiful woman and a little girl. The older woman caressed the image with trembling fingers. "Soon, son," she murmured. "Soon everyone will know the truth." The safe place turned out to be a small cabin on the outskirts of Portland, near Forest Park. It was a simple but solid construction, surrounded by pines and far enough from other dwellings to guarantee privacy. Emily observed how Michael meticulously checked the surroundings before allowing them to enter, while Robert remained silent, as if mentally preparing for what he was about to reveal. The interior of the cabin was austere: a wooden table with 4 chairs, an old sofa, a small kitchen, and some shelves with books. What caught Emily's attention was a wall covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and maps connected with red strings, like a detective's investigation board. "My brother never stopped looking for answers," explained Robert, noticing Emily's gaze. "Even when I gave up and decided to disappear." Michael approached the refrigerator and took out 3 bottles of water, offering one to Emily. "I didn't give up because I knew you were alive," he responded with intensity, "even when everyone else presumed you were gone." Emily took a seat in one of the chairs, taking out her recorder. "Do you mind if I record this?" she asked, maintaining professionalism despite the extraordinary situation she found herself in. The brothers exchanged a look before Robert nodded. "I want this to be recorded," he said, "in case something happens to us." Michael sat facing them, his face tense. "I suppose we should start at the beginning," he said, "about who my brother really is." Robert took a deep breath before speaking. "My real name is Robert Mitchell Davis. 15 years ago, I was the chief accountant for the Vaughan Business Group." Emily tried to maintain a neutral expression, but the surprise must have been evident on her face. This directly connected to Edward Vaughan, one of the most powerful men in Oregon. "For 5 years," Robert continued, "I handled all the group's accounts. It was a respectable, well-paid job. I had a wife, Sarah, and a 6-year-old daughter, Lily. We lived well, without excessive luxuries, but comfortably. I trusted Vaughan. I considered him almost a mentor." His voice broke slightly when mentioning his family. Michael put a hand on his brother's shoulder in a silent gesture of support. "One day, reviewing some documents for the annual declaration, I found discrepancies." Robert took out the gold watch and placed it on the table. "Large amounts of money that entered and left the companies without clear justification. At first I thought it was a mistake, so I kept investigating. What I discovered was a money laundering network that operated from Vaughan's legitimate businesses." Emily took some notes while the recorder continued running. "What did you do with that information?" "What any honest citizen would have done," Robert responded bitterly. "I went directly to Vaughan, naive as I was, believing that perhaps he wasn't aware, that someone was using his companies without his knowledge." Michael let out a heavy sigh, as if reliving that moment through his brother's words. "Vaughan feigned surprise," Robert continued. "He thanked me for my loyalty and asked me for all the documentation to personally investigate. He told me to keep the matter in absolute secrecy for the good of the company, and I believed him." He paused, taking the watch in his hands again, caressing the inscription on its back. 3 days later, I was at home with Sarah and Lily. It was my daughter's birthday. His voice became slower, as if each word cost him a physical effort. I received a call from Vaughn asking me to urgently come to the office. I told him I couldn't, that we were celebrating. He insisted, said it was about what we had discussed, that he had discovered something important. Michael stood up and walked to the window, turning his back on them as if he couldn't bear to hear this part of the story again. I left my family celebrating and went to the office. When I arrived, it was empty, completely empty. I waited almost an hour until I received a call from my neighbor screaming that there was smoke coming from my house. Emily felt a knot in her throat. Although Robert hadn't explicitly said it, she could imagine what had happened. When I arrived, the firefighters were already there. Robert continued in a monotonous voice, as if he had emotionally disconnected to be able to keep talking. The house was destroyed. They told me it had been a gas leak, a terrible accident. Sarah and Lily, Emily murmured. The rescuers couldn't get there in time, responded Michael from the window, taking over from his brother who seemed unable to continue. It was presented as a tragic accident, but Robert knew the truth. Vaughn had ordered him silenced, and when he couldn't find him, he made sure he had nothing to live for. Emily looked at Robert, whose face now showed a mixture of pain and determination. This watch, Robert finally said, raising the golden piece, I always carried it with me. It was my father's, who taught me the value of honesty. That night, I'd left it at home because Lily wanted to see it. For some reason, it survived the fire. The firefighters gave it to me the next day. And what happened after that? Asked Emily, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the shock she felt. I knew they would come for me, Robert responded. So I disappeared. Michael helped me create a new identity. I became Robert Wilson, a mechanic with no past who came to Portland seeking tranquility. For years I thought it had worked, that Vaughn believed I had also been destroyed in the fire. Until 3 nights ago. Emily remembered her visit to the shop the day after the storm. The men who entered your shop recognized the watch, completed Robert, and that means Vaughn knows I'm alive. He knows I have proof of what he did 15 years ago. Michael returned to the table and opened a briefcase that Emily hadn't noticed before. From it, he took out a folder with documents. During these years, I've been collecting evidence, explained the professor, at first to find my brother, then to prove Vaughn's guilt. There are witnesses who saw suspicious men near the house before the fire. There are bank records that my brother managed to copy, and there's this. Michael took out a photograph showing Edward Vaughn shaking hands with a sinister-looking man. Frank Rivers, he said. A known hitman who worked for power groups at that time. He mysteriously disappeared shortly after the fire at my brother's house. Emily observed the documents, her journalistic mind quickly processing all the information. With all this, we could expose Vaughn, she finally said. We could bring justice. It's not that simple, interjected Robert. Vaughn has connections everywhere. The police, the government, the media. Why do you think no investigation prospered after the accident? But I'm not alone, argued Emily with determination. I have contacts in the prosecutor's office, in international media. If we publish this simultaneously on several channels... A noise outside interrupted the conversation. The three remained motionless, listening. Michael approached the window, stealthily, and looked outside. An unknown car just parked at the end of the road, he informed in a low voice. And I don't think they're hikers. The tension in the cabin instantly rose. Robert stood up and began to collect the most important documents. We have to go, he said, with a calmness that contradicted the situation. There's an exit through the back that leads to the forest. Emily quickly stored her recorder and notes, feeling how adrenaline began to flow through her body. How did they find us? She asked, as she followed the brothers to the back of the cabin. They must have followed us from the park, responded Michael. We underestimated their surveillance. Robert opened a small back door that led to a path between the pines. Before going out, he turned to Emily with an intense gaze. You can still stay, Miss Parker. Say that we deceived you, that you didn't. Know what you were getting into. Vaughn has nothing against you, and yet... Emily held his gaze with determination. I've spent my entire career seeking the truth, Mr. Mitchell. I'm not going to hide now that I've found it." For the first time since she had known him, Emily saw a genuine smile on Robert's face. Without saying more, the three entered the forest, while the voices of unknown men began to be heard closer and closer to the cabin. The forest became their refuge and their labyrinth. Emily followed the Wilson brothers through the dense vegetation, grateful for having chosen comfortable shoes that morning, although she never would have imagined that she would end up fleeing between pines and oaks. Michael, who seemed to know the terrain well, guided them with confidence while Robert constantly watched their backs. "There's a shelter about 2 kilometers away," explained Michael in a low voice. "I prepared it years ago in case something like this ever happened." "Always so foresighted, little brother," commented Robert with a touch of irony that didn't hide his gratitude. Emily noticed that he carried the briefcase with the documents firmly pressed against his chest, as if it were the most valuable thing he possessed. And it probably was. The only tangible proof of the truth that had remained buried for 15 years. After half an hour of walking, they arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned cabin, almost completely covered by vegetation. Michael removed some dry branches that concealed the entrance and guided them inside. The place was even more austere than the previous cabin, a single room with a cot, some basic supplies, and an old shortwave radio. "It's not the Ritz," said Michael as he lit an oil lamp, "but it will keep us safe until we can plan our next move." Emily dropped onto an old wooden trunk that served as a seat, feeling for the first time the weight of everything she had discovered in the last few hours. Her life had irrevocably changed from the moment she entered that auto repair shop. "What now?" she asked, looking at the brothers. "What's the plan?" Robert spread the documents on a makeshift table. "We need to get this to the right authorities," he responded. "Not to the local police, but directly to the Attorney General's office. And we need the press to cover it simultaneously, so they can't hide it." "I can contact my editor," offered Emily. "But first we need to organize all this information coherently, create a narrative that leaves no room for doubt." Michael turned on the radio and began to search for frequencies. "We also need to know what's happening out there," he said. "If Vaughn has already mobilized his contacts to look for us." While Michael manipulated the radio, Emily and Robert concentrated on organizing the documentation. For the journalist, it was fascinating to see how all the pieces fit together. The bank records clearly showed patterns of money laundering. The photographs connected Vaughn with people of dubious reputation. The newspaper clippings about the accident revealed inconsistencies in the investigation. "All of this is pure dynamite," murmured Emily. "With half of these proofs, any honest prosecutor would open a case. The problem is finding one who isn't on Vaughn's payroll," responded Robert with bitterness. It was then that Michael managed to tune to a clear frequency. The voice of a news anchor filled the small cabin. "We repeat the breaking news. The state police are intensively searching for mechanic Robert Wilson, the main suspect in a violent altercation that occurred 3 nights ago in his shop, where 2 men were seriously injured. According to authorities, Wilson could be armed and is considered dangerous. Journalist Emily Parker, who was last seen in the company of the suspect, is also being sought for questioning." Michael turned off the radio, and a heavy silence settled in the cabin. "It's begun," he finally said. "They're building their narrative to discredit us." Emily felt a chill. In a matter of hours, she had gone from being a respected journalist to a fugitive. "This changes things," she said, trying to keep calm. "Now we not only have to expose Vaughn, but also clear our names." Robert approached the small window, looking at the forest that surrounded them. "Maybe we should separate," he suggested. "I'm the one they're really looking for. You two might have a better chance if—" "Don't even think about it," Michael interrupted him. "I haven't searched for you for 15 years to abandon you now. And I'm not going to leave the story of my life," added Emily with determination. "Besides, if we separate, it will be easier for them to catch us one by one." Robert looked at them with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Then we have to be smarter than them," he finally said. "And I have an idea." As night fell over Forest Park, a tense meeting was taking place in Edward Vaughn's mansion. The businessman, usually composed and elegant, showed evident signs of nervousness as he spoke on the phone. What do you mean you lost them? His voice contained barely controlled fury. The forest has a limited perimeter. They can't simply have disappeared. On the other end of the line, one of his men tried to explain the situation, but Vaughn wasn't interested in excuses. Find Mitchell and that journalist before dawn, he ordered. And when you do, bring me that damn watch and all the documents they have. The rest, I'll handle it as you see fit. When he hung up, he noticed a presence at the door of his study. It was Nancy, his personal assistant for the past 20 years, who was looking at him with an indecipherable expression. "How long have you been there?" asked Vaughn, trying to compose himself. "Long enough," she responded, advancing toward the desk. "Robert Mitchell has returned, hasn't he?" Vaughn poured himself a whiskey before responding. "It seems our ghost has decided to return from the dead," he said with a forced smile. "But don't worry, the situation is under control." Nancy looked at him fixedly. Like it was 15 years ago, her tone was unusually incisive. "I thought you had ensured that problem was definitively resolved." "And it will be," affirmed Vaughn. "Before the day ends, Robert Mitchell will once again be just a memory." Nancy nodded slowly, as if she were making an important decision. "Good. I'll retire then. Have a good night, Edward." When the door closed behind her, Vaughn couldn't help but feel an inexplicable unease. Nancy never questioned his decisions. Never. Meanwhile, at a hotel in downtown Portland, Emily Parker discreetly entered through a side door. With a hat that partially concealed her face and different clothes than when the door closed behind her, Vaughn couldn't help but feel an inexplicable unease. Nancy never questioned his decisions. Never. Meanwhile, at a hotel in downtown Portland, Emily Parker discreetly entered through a side door. With a hat that partially concealed her face and different clothes than she had worn that morning, she was difficult to recognize. At the reception, she urgently asked to speak with Jessica Vega. Her colleague from the newsroom came down minutes later, with astonishment painted on her face when she saw Emily. "My God, Emily," she exclaimed in a low voice. "You're on all the news channels. The police are looking for you to—" "It's all lies, Jessica," Emily interrupted her. "I'm involved in something big, bigger than I imagined. I need your help." In a secluded booth in the hotel restaurant, Emily quickly explained the situation to her friend. She gave her a copy of the most important documents and the recording of the conversation with the Wilson brothers. "I need you to keep this in a safe place," she instructed, "and be ready to publish it tomorrow at first light." Simultaneously, with other media outlets, Michael is contacting international journalists right now. Jessica took the documents with a serious expression. "Are you sure about this, Emily? Edward Vaughn is not someone to mess with." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Emily responded. "This man has been using his power to hide his crimes for years. It's time for him to pay." "And what about you?" asked Jessica, genuinely concerned. "Where are you staying?" Emily smiled enigmatically. "It's better you don't know, but I'll contact you tomorrow before everything explodes. I just need you to promise me something. No matter what happens, make sure this story sees the light of day." After a quick hug, Emily disappeared again into the Portland night, while the plan they had devised in the forest cabin began to unfold. The next morning, Nancy entered Vaughn's office with a pale face and a newspaper in her hands. "I think you should see this," she said, extending the paper to him. On the front page, with a photograph of Edward Vaughn, it read, "Renowned businessman linked to corruption networks and family attack." The article, signed by Jessica Vega, detailed the accusations supported by documents and testimonies. Vaughn barely had time to process the news when his phone began to ring incessantly. His contacts in the police, in the government, in the media, all wanted to know if the accusations were true. All wanted to distance themselves from the scandal that was beginning to form. "How is this possible?" he muttered, running a trembling hand through his perfectly groomed hair. "How did they manage to publish this?" Nancy observed him with a calmness that contrasted with her boss's growing panic. "It seems you underestimated the journalist," she commented, "and Robert." Vaughn looked at her with sudden suspicion. "Why do you talk about him like that, as if you knew him?" Nancy approached the desk and, to Vaughan's surprise, placed a familiar object on it, the antique gold watch. "Because I do know him," she responded, with a voice that no longer tried to hide her contempt. "Because I was there when you ordered his family destroyed. Because I've been waiting for this moment for 15 years. Vaughan observed the watch, and then Nancy, understanding slowly, dawning on his face. Have you been working with him? All this time?" Nancy smiled, a smile loaded with 15 years of patience. "I've been working for justice, Edward, and today it has finally arrived." As if on cue, the door to the office opened. Robert entered, followed by Emily, Michael, and 2 agents from the Attorney General's office who showed their credentials. "Edward Vaughan," said one of the agents, "you are under arrest for the crimes of corruption, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit an attack against the Mitchell family." While the agents proceeded with the arrest, Robert approached Nancy and took her hands with emotion. "Auntie..." "Nancy," he said, his voice full of feeling, "without you this would never have been possible." Nancy Mitchell, his father's sister, the woman who had sacrificed 15 years of her life infiltrating Vaughan's inner circle to obtain the evidence that now incriminated him, hugged her nephew tightly. "Your father would be proud," she told him, caressing the watch that now rested again in Robert's hands. "And I'm sure that Sarah and Lily can finally rest in peace." 2 weeks later, Emily was typing the final paragraphs of her article in the newsroom of the Portland Truth. The special report on the Vaughan case had captured national and international attention, becoming the most important work of her career. But beyond the professional recognition, she felt the satisfaction of having contributed to justice being served. Robert Mitchell, now publicly rehabilitated, had decided to keep his auto repair shop. "It's who I am now," he had told Emily in their last conversation. Robert Mitchell died 15 years ago with his family. Robert Wilson is who survived and who must move forward. Michael had returned to Ann Arbor, but now maintained regular contact with his brother. The wall that had separated them for years, built with secrets and pain, had finally fallen. And Nancy, after testifying in the trial against Vaughan, had decided to retire to a small house on the Oregon coast, where she could finally rest from her long mission. Emily's phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Robert, inviting her for coffee. She smiled as she responded, affirmatively. Despite how they had started, or perhaps precisely because of it, something special had emerged between them. A bond forged in the search for truth, in the fight against injustice. She saved her work and took her bag. Outside, Portland shone, under the afternoon sun. In the pocket of her jacket, she carried a small recorder. Some stories deserved to be told completely. And this one, the story of the Portland mechanic, was just beginning its new chapter. Dear listeners, we hope that Robert and Emily's story has moved you and shown you the power of truth and perseverance. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special collection with equally captivating stories about second chances and justice. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique tales that explore the complexity of life and the triumph of the human spirit. What would you have done in Robert's place? Do you believe there are secrets that deserve to remain buried? We await you in the comments to continue this conversation. See you tomorrow with a new story you won't want to miss.